focus will be on issues of federalism, governance, and sectoral policies. And for this, I actually, I wouldn't say requested, I snatched from Devanshu the chance to be the master of ceremonies for today's keynote presentation. Because both the people involved with today's keynote presentation, Rupak and Rajeshwari, are people that I have known for the last 25 years. Welcome, Pankaj ji, for the keynote session of today. I was just introducing Rupak and Rajeshwari. It becomes very difficult to refer to Rupak as Dr. Rupak and Rajeshwari as Dr. Rajeshwari, because we have known them so well as good friends. And with their permission, I would still address them by their first name without any prefixes attached to that. Let me start by introducing Rupak with what I read, what a very well-known scholar had written about him. That scholar had said Rupak is insightful, mature, highly knowledgeable, deals with people in a comfortable, confident, clear, and friendly manner. Do we need a better introduction for our keynote speaker of today in terms of the type of person that he is? Rupak is a double master's, a master's in economics from the University of Ottawa, and a master's in political science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He did his PhD from the University of Toronto in 2002. And he has been one of those associated with the Forum of Federations, a international network working on federalism and devolved governance ever since it occupied a center stage in global affairs. In 2002, he was its program officer, went on to become its program manager, went on to become a director, went on to become its senior director, went on to become its vice president. And 10 years back in 2011, he became the president and the CEO of the Forum of Federations. I'm privileged to be a senior advisor of the Forum of Federations and have worked with Rupak for the last 2 decades. And I have been witness to his skills of leadership, and not just his skills of leadership, his skills of the intellect to be able to explain issues in a very, very sophisticated way. Thank you, Rupak, for joining us today. For the friends in India, let me say, for Rupak, it's 6:30 in the morning. In Toronto, it's 6:30 a.m. now. And Rupak did not even bat an eyelid when he saw the timing of the session. I know Rupak is an early riser, but then to get ready for a presentation at 6:30, hats off to you, Rupak, and thank you for agreeing to do this. To chair this session, we have another distinguished academic in Professor Rajeshwari Deshpande. Dr. Deshpande is currently a professor of political science at the Savitribai Phule Pune University. Again, Rajeshwari's research and academic journey and her work in academics began around the time we started an institution, a academic body called Lokniti, and Rajeshwari has been part of it since the first day of Lokniti being there. She specializes on the study of the urban poor, on women's politics and comparative politics. She's a lead researcher of the European Commission on its project on cultural heritage and identities. She has just completed an ICSSR project on inequalities, welfare, and democracy. And the journal which Lokniti comes out with, called Studies in Indian Politics, which is a Scopus Index journal and ranked in the top bracket now globally. She heads the teaching and learning discussion forum there. I would rate Dr. Rajeshwari as one of those scholars on Indian politics, one of those emerging scholars of Indian politics belonging to that generation which started their research in the 1990s and has now carved a niche for herself. And beyond a shadow of doubt, Rajeshwari is not just a great scholar, but she's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful human being. And that's what makes her as a researcher extremely special. So thank you, Rupak and Rajeshwari, for being here with us in this session. Our format will be this. Rupak will take around the first 30-40 minutes to make his presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A. Rajeshwari, how would you like to do it? Would you like to look at the questions in the chat box yourself, or would you want somebody to look at it and pass it on to you? Whichever is available to you as the chair.
Yeah, it would be great if somebody does it.
Okay. So my colleague Divanshu will look at the questions and then forward it to you, and you can then forward. And we will have a Q&A followed at the end by Rajeshwari's closing comments. So that would be how we would spend the next 90 minutes, which is available to us. So Rupak, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for that very emphatic welcome, Sandeep. When you asked me to do this, I didn't even have to think twice. So no matter what time it was, I would have certainly have done it. So I'm very privileged that you thought of me and asked me to participate in this. It's wonderful to see so many friends here today. Of course, Sandeep, Shailaja, Priyanka, Rajeshwari, and Pankaj, who I've known now for almost 20 years, if not more. So it's wonderful to be surrounded by friends and colleagues like this. It really is a privilege for me to be speaking at an August conference like this with so many distinguished people on the panel and in the audience. So I certainly hope that I will live up to the hype that Sandeep has created. My presentation will be about 30 minutes, maybe a little less, because I would then prefer to address as much as possible in the context of the question and answer. I always find that in this sort of Zoom format, that is probably more productive than, as we all know, for the last year and a half, this has changed the way we do things and manage our lives and manage our manage our academics. So thank you again for this emphatic welcome. Great to see you all and to work with you. Thank you again for inviting me to speak on the issue of social policy reforms. I believe yesterday you talked about the welfare state, and that is what the keynote was about. In my comments this morning, I'll focus specifically on social policy making and reforms in the context of federal and multi-level governance. The late Ron Watts, who was sort of the leading scholar globally of comparative federalism, defined federalism as a technique of constitutional organization that permits action by shared government for certain common purposes, together with autonomous action by constituent unit governments for other purposes that relate to maintaining their distinctiveness, with each level being directly responsible to its own electorate. Now, one of the things I've learned in the last 2 decades is that the world is not binary. It is not federal or non-federal. Really, it is a continuum of various kinds of systems, some more decentralized than others. But more and more, I think in the last 20 years, we see more and more decentralization in many parts of the world. 25 years ago, when I taught comparative politics, the United Kingdom was the prototypical example of a centralized unitary state. Of course, much has changed since. It's not quite a federation, but there are far too many hybrid systems for us to consider the term federalism or federal or in a very rigid and binary fashion. It's quite appropriate that I'm speaking here today at a conference co-organized between the Jagran University and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, because the Konrad Adenauer Foundation is named for a person who himself was quite a pioneer in the area of social policy. But also Germany, as many of you know, was the modern pioneer. I don't say a modern pioneer, but the modern pioneer in the provision of public goods such as universal education, healthcare, income support, so on and so forth. Konrad Adenauer himself was born and grew up in Cologne, which then was part of the Kingdom of Prussia. And the Kingdom of Prussia is significant because the Kingdom of Prussia in 1763 established the world's first modern system of universal education so that every Prussian from the age of 5 to 14 received a comprehensive, compulsory, and secular education. While this particular reform predated German unification, its demonstration effect across other German states is very well documented, so that by the 1840s, all Prussians and most Germans were literate. This is a feat not achieved in the rest of Europe, including in the UK and France, until almost 50 years later. Following the creation of the Federal North German Confederation in 1867 and the Federated German Empire in 1871, federally driven social policy innovation would continue. The introduction of old age pension and universal healthcare under Bismarck are well known, and were very, very important catalysts for raising German productivity and economic performance. Even though in the constitution of the North German Federation and then what became the Federated German Empire, social policy was the remit essentially of the state governments, but the federal government was able to lead on this and created the conditions for dynamic economic growth and productivity in Germany, so that between 1840 and 1900, productivity in Germany increased by 190%. Just to put this into to context and to compare with other major European countries of the time, productivity in Switzerland during the same period went up 90%, in Sweden by 75%, in Britain by 60%, in Italy by 50%, in Belgium by 35%, and in France by only 30%. So social policy is very, very important, I believe, as a bedrock for building resilient societies and robust economies. I think what Germany has done is to show the world the importance of good social policy in underwriting social economic performance and national progress. The relationship between federalism and social policies is not a new question. And it was something that since the 1970s, at least, has been investigated in a lot of detail, with often no conclusion. The relationship is often seen as being actually one of contradictory outcomes, because federalism, as you all know, is characterized by dispersing power, increasing the number of actors with veto powers in the legislatures, in society, and the attempt of trying to aggregate all of these interests to establish social welfare policies, which even in the best of times, as we know from our own experiences in our own countries, in Canada, in India, in Germany, is not an easy feat. In some countries with actually very well-established social welfare states, countries like Germany and Switzerland, people continuously complain that efficiency and social policy is held hostage by federalism, and that decision-making is complicated in favor of the lowest common denominator. In other countries, federalism is criticized for encouraging unpredictable unilateral policy changes that impede the development of consistent countrywide approaches to policy challenges. Of course, recent experiences in the United States and the difficulties around the implementation and universalization of Obamacare suggest that reforms are almost impossible. But lived experience over the last century would suggest otherwise. Critical junctures allow countries to overcome social, political, and institutional constraint, and federations are no exception to this rule. The introduction of income taxes was made possible by the needs of the First World War. Public works and income support programs across much of the developed world were made possible by the Great Depression, and universal healthcare and universal social security policies, again in most of the developed world, were made possible by the post-war consensus on rebuilding. COVID-19, in my view, has created such a critical juncture for policy making. It's a rare historical episode that makes us experience the present against the backdrop of possibilities that until very recently were very difficult to imagine. Moreover, such critical junctures are critical because decisions made under these conditions can have long-term consequences. It's no coincidence that everywhere in the world, leadership at the federal and provincial levels are talking about seizing the moment to build back better. Governments are still preoccupied with short-term emergency responses, but are putting in place the building blocks of in my view, long-term policy reform that will play out over the next decades to come. The challenge, of course, is for the moment for most governments to take a step back from the immediate firefighting that is required from managing the pandemic and supporting livelihoods, but putting in places social policies to support these short-term firefighting measures against the pandemic are actually creating pathways to reform that I think will stand most countries in good stead when it comes to building welfare states and putting in place appropriate policy reforms. I think the most important impact that the policy that the pandemic has had on in policy circles is to put an end to what was considered the Washington consensus, the retreating state, small government. I think we are entering an era of big government that is likely to stay in place for a while, simply because lower orders of government, state governments, local governments, have lost their autonomy of action because of the economic situation in most countries and their inability to mobilize taxes, and therefore are likely to remain reliant for an extended period of time on higher order governments or national governments playing a very, very important role. The pandemic has also brought to the fore issues of public health and long-term healthcare, which were very important in many countries already, but never really occupied center stage because national governments and state governments had other policy priorities, immediate operational priorities that often took precedence over these long-term areas that need long-term investments. In this context, I think we will see the current window of opportunity being used to address an array of fundamentally interrelated policy challenges, from public health to global warming to economic inequality and the systemic marginal and dealing with the systemically marginalized groups of vulnerable people. Although, as I said, these policy issues have been on the research agenda of academics elsewhere, I think governments are increasingly realizing that these are areas that they need to address, not just in the context of managing a pandemic, but also in the context of economic resilience. And if one thing the COVID-19 pandemic has shown policymakers is how this has upended economies everywhere, because last year when the pandemic hit, in most countries, economies were put in, economic activity was put into suspended animation, which has had real impact on livelihoods, but also on the aspirations of many countries in terms of bringing more people out of poverty, and those kinds of economic policies to secure the vulnerable and marginal population. In Canada, Germany, and elsewhere, reconstructive leadership, collaborative federalism, and the development of a multi-pronged approach that outlines mutually enforcing policy goals and feasible instruments are of particular importance. A resilient federation should avoid the pathologies of federal governance that I mentioned earlier, deadlock, poor policy outcomes. Resilience is more commonly understood as the capacity of an organization to evolve dynamically in the face of shocks and stresses, as well as other subtler and more gradually emerging problems. This implies sustaining and balancing continuity while promoting adaptive change because clearly the world has changed because in light of the pandemic. The two challenges to the advancement of transformative policies is, of course, number one, redirecting away from what. Let me rephrase this. I think the biggest challenge, the biggest two challenges, is one, redirecting away sufficiently from what doesn't work, without having to throw out ideas that have in the past. So governments have to, well, governments not have to, they are in many countries looking at what has worked in the past in terms of social policy and what has not worked, and have to now continually balance the whole issue of spending more money with becoming with creating a fiscal situation that causes high interest and leads to and becomes fiscally unsustainable. And you know, this in my view is going to be the biggest challenge that governments both in federations and non-federations are dealing with. The other big challenge I think governments have to deal with is to ensure that the initial policy changes now being put in place become irreversible, in that once the crisis has passed, we don't go back to doing business as usual. This challenge requires governments to be more invested in engaging stakeholders, for national governments, stakeholders at the level of provincial and state governments, and also with stakeholders at the level of voters, in order to explain to them why these reforms are necessary. And in my own experience, governments do a very, I mean, in India, you know, I read some of the debates about the incumbent federal government doing a very poor job of explaining its policy to the public. But this is not unique to India. Governments everywhere do very poor job of explaining policy reforms to their own constituents. But a truly resilient federation is capable, in my view, of coping with both challenges. It's important, I think, to recognize that political, economic, social, and institutional constraints make swift policy change difficult in normal times in all countries. This is, of course, more complex in federations. But the reason countries choose a federal system is because they are large or diverse or both. And thus such federations are typically socially and economically more complex than their unitary counterparts. And so one should expect complexities in trying to move towards new policy pathways in federations. But it's important because federalism aggregates and mediates diverse interests. And so in countries that are highly diverse, federalism is probably the best institutional structure through which new policies can be enunciated and appropriate outcomes arrived at. But it's important for me to emphasize that federal unilateralism is not a viable pathway to consolidate transformative change. It's true that in the current context, one is likely to see a greater move towards centralization. The fact of the matter is, when local governments and state and provincial governments have lost access to tax revenues, they become much more reliant on national governments, because at this point in time, it is only national governments who have the ability to create money, given their control over currency. But it's very important that in order to shield these changes and these reforms, that federal governments have to work with their stakeholders at the subnational level and arrive at policies that provide a positive policy feedback in order for them to be sustainable. Scholars of federalism often look to the United States as a prototype federation and juxtapose its dysfunction and inability to build a welfare state on federalism. But this ignores both the history of the United States as well as the diversity of federal models that exist globally. Indeed, the United States is a presidential federation, and the separation of powers between the executive and the legislature has certain implications for how laws can be made and how difficult or how easy it is for an incumbent administration to push through policy reform. But if one looks within the American continent and the two South American presidential federations, Argentina and Brazil, it's possible to see that economic progress as well as expanded social policy making is possible if there is a consensus to do so, especially given the experience of Brazil and Argentina between 2004 and 2011, where you saw administrations that were very, very engaged and interested in expanding social policy, while at the same time maintaining economic growth. The ability to undertake policy reform and establish social policy depends on specific institutional configurations. Different institutional arrangements and the configuration of politics, of course, can have an impact in the way health, education, social assistance programs are put in place from the perspective of universality and equality. Democratic federations are characterized by the existence of autonomous levels of power in which governments are formed through elections based on party competition. And the way parties are organized at national and subnational levels characterize party systems in federations as they do elsewhere. Levels of cohesion, party discipline, and the relations between social cleavages and political party systems all play a very important role in the way policymaking occurs. In this, I'm merely restating what Leiphart, Riker, or Stepan have long argued in their own work. Nationalized party systems, combined with the presence of pro-welfare state parties, can favor the expansion of universal and redistributive policies, as well as macroeconomic contexts with greater stability and prosperity. And again, I return to the social democratic systems in Europe, particularly in Germany, where there is across the political spectrum consensus on the need for expansive social policy. I want to take a slight liberty. For those of you who follow German politics, I mean, given that we are talking about the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is the foundation of the Christian Democratic Party, you will notice, perhaps if you follow German politics, that for the first 40 years after the reconstitution of the Federal Republic of Germany, 70% of the popular vote went to two parties, the CDU on the right of the political spectrum, and the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, on the center-left of the spectrum. But over the last 10 years or so, the SPD has been in what some observers of German politics call a turbulent decline, with their popular support now trailing in the teens. I'm making this point not so much to criticize one party or the other, but just to make the point that in a country like Germany, with a broad range of political parties representing a broad range of political dispensations, given the national consensus on social welfare state, perhaps the need for a social democratic party is no longer required, because everybody subscribes to that idea. And so, to make the point that in federalism, it is possible to build expansive, progressive social policies. To the south of Germany, in what I would call business-friendly, low-tax Switzerland, which, unlike Germany, encourages tax competition amongst the cantons. Even here, there is a prevailing national consensus on social policy. And so the outcomes that you see are very different from the outcomes one sees, for example, in the United States. The Swiss cantons, which are usually very protective of their own educational policy and have been for decades, have been prodded by the federal government in recent times to ensure comparable standards in education thereby ensuring portability of standards across the country. So driven by self-interest, cantons who have normally had a veto on social policy have tried to create sort of universal policy on social questions. Quite apart from social political consensus, there is, of course, another way in which federations arrive at expansive universal social policy, and that is through the use of fiscal federalism and the spending power of federations. And this is particularly true in the context of COVID-19. Of course, in countries such as Australia, Brazil, and in India, one is very familiar with centrally sponsored schemes, which are very large sums of money, through which the federal governments can induce state governments to carry out policy reforms. Even in countries like Canada and Switzerland, where the bulk of the public expenditure is at subnational level, federal governments can lead on policy reforms through the exercise of federal spending power, either in the form of special purpose grants, co-funding arrangements, or even an untied formula based on transfers that impel national acceptance of federal policy. I'm not suggesting here at all that federal governments have all the wisdom and state governments none. But federal governments, in my view, play a very important role in aggregating and standardizing policies that are likely to have universal appeal. And therefore, the role of national governments, of federal governments in policy reform are central in a way that they are not at the subnational level. I think where policy reforms at the subnational level are important is, of course, in the context of the jurisdiction of that particular subnational government, but also in having a demonstration effect more largely. I think it's also important to realize that federalism stands in most countries on two legs, on the federal government and on the subnational leg of provincial and state governments. And no policy reform is possible or sustainable until both work in sync. I mentioned previously the challenges and limitations of Obamacare. However, even in the United States, the Obama administration continued and expanded the No Child Left Behind education policy put in place by the Bush administration, because this was relatively uncontroversial, ideologically speaking, but also one that all states have agreed with. And so this is very, very important that it's possible, when you consult appropriately with subnational entities, to create universal social policy. In Canada, the high incidence of COVID-related deaths in old age homes has led the federal government to using its spending power to establish national standards in an area that fall well within the remit of provincial governments. And indeed, as the pandemic has demonstrated, increased intergovernmental collaboration is crucial to adequately address social policy challenges in all countries. The pandemic has shown that no one level of government is capable of dealing with the challenges brought on by the pandemic on its own. This was also very much the conclusion of a 24-country case study that we've done at the forum, and which Sandeep very kindly reviewed as the outside reviewer. And what we find is that increasingly, even in countries where there is no history of national governments talking in an institutionalized fashion to subnational governments on policies, that more and more federal governments, state governments are interacting with each other, not always agreeing, but at least talking to each other about what makes sense and what kind of policies each would like to see. India, I think, is a good example where the Prime Minister in the last 18 months has met more often with his state counterparts than in the previous 20 years. And India is certainly not an outlier in this. Spain, another country which has a similar structure to India in terms of the intergovernmental fora being not very highly institutionalized. The Spanish Prime Minister in the last 18 months has met at least once a month with all the premiers of the provincial governments. as compared to 5 times over the last 15 years. So I think we will see more collaboration, even if money now is more in the hands of the federal government. I think the federal government will find that it is incumbent upon it now to consult more with the state governments if it wants to spend its resources wisely in building up resilience to the kinds of disruptions caused by the pandemic. At a recent webinar that I was listening to, Junaid Ahmed, who is the World Bank country director in India, identified in the context of India what he called the positive shock of COVID-19, which has forced the government of India, in his view, to pivot more closely at looking at 2 things. One is creating an urban social security net, which has been present in India now for more than a decade on the rural side through NREGA, but also in doubling down on in creating portability of social services and social assistance through the various schemes and through the creation of the Jan Dhan bank accounts into which social assistance can be directly paid. Even though this has been acrimonious and controversial, I do believe that reforms like this will really pay off over the next decades. And again, India is certainly not unique in this. We see these kinds of social policies being put in place even in the first world. I notice that I'm running up against my time limit here. So let me end by saying that federalism certainly, the federal context is certainly very, very crucial in trying to understand the complexities of reform in many of the larger, more populous, more diverse countries in the world. But as history shows, and as we see today under the conditions of COVID, states, national governments, subnational governments are responding to the challenges posed by COVID. And the fact that we are now here talking digitally is also a harbinger of what we are likely to see in governance going forward, where more and more governments work digitally. And in the past, digital government meant essentially taking paper forms that had to be filled out in triplicate and putting them online for people to download. But I think going forward, we will see something that's completely different. In countries like Canada and Australia, it has always been, governments have always used the excuse of data privacy, autonomy of information at the state level to shy away from creating digital services. But I think this is something that they can no longer stay away from. And I think more and more national governments in many of these countries will have to set standards for digital information and digital services, so that you can have cross-jurisdictional communications when it comes to the portability of healthcare, social assistance, education. So these are all changes in the future, but certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has provided a catalyst. So let me end here, and we can go into question and answer sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rupak, for this very broad, a quick global recap of the challenges posed by the pandemic for all of us and what federal governments can do about it. We would now open the session for questions and answers, right, Divyanshu?
Surely, ma'am. So we have the first question there. Shall I pose the question, ma'am, or shall I send it to you, whatever you suggest?
No. You please go ahead and ask.
So yeah. So the first question for Rupak sir here is by Sivaram sir there. So he's asking, sir, would it be possible for you to explain a bit on some of the innovative solutions Forum of Federation has implemented for the federalism? So if we can quickly get insights on like a couple of those points across.
In the context of the pandemic, or more broadly?
Sir, I would suggest that if we take it on a broad sense, covering a pandemic thing, that would be really nice to take that thing ahead.
Okay, so I mean, I don't know about innovative solutions because this is always hard. It's always hard to say what is innovative. That is for others to say. For me, to draw that
Yes,
conclusion.
I'm sorry, sir, I'm interrupting between. So he has a rider to his question as well. He says that he is presenting a paper on scriptures and innovations. So if your answer can somewhere ride on that particular thing from the scriptures or the innovations or something.
I think the biggest innovations. I think the biggest contribution the Forum of Federations has made in the last 20 years is to move away from the binary of federal, non-federal, and to say that, look, there are certain processes that exist in federal systems which may be applicable in systems that are unitary or decentralized. And the two things I think that one can take away from this is, one, the realization that subsidiarity matters, which means that that the level of government closest to the people, local governments, I think, have a very important role to play in the delivery of services, because they can provide services that best fit the needs of the population and can pivot more easily to changing circumstances at the local level. I think the second thing I think that we all realize is that it's very important to adequately resource each level of government for the functions that it has, because without that, decentralization, localization is meaningless. So at a very broad level, I would say these are the two important takeaways, I think.
Thank you so much, sir. And I guess that would have been a good answer to what the real perspective of that question was. It moves me to the next question, which is asked by Ritika ma'am there. How do you address...
Can I come in, Divanshu, for a minute?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, please.
Can I come in for a minute? Yeah. How much time do we have for questions and answers?
So, ma'am, we have a total of 10 minutes for the question answer session. Okay. So we will take like...
Divanshu, we are now at 4:45. We need to close this session by 5:20, I think.
Yes.
By 5:20. And Rajeshwari, if you could make your concluding remarks at 5:10. So which means we have around 20 minutes more. We have around 20 minutes more.
Yes, and I was just wondering whether Dr. Chattopadhyay would like to collect a few questions and then sort of reply, or how would we go about it? That's what I wanted to check with you.
What would be fine for you?
Either is fine for me, whatever is easy.
So Rajeshwari ma'am, I guess we can take one-on-one question. That would be much better.
No problem. Yeah.
Okay, sir. So with this, I move to the second question, which is asked by Ritika ma'am there, that how do you address the problem of access to digital for countries like India, especially the rural India?
I think access to digital is a challenge at two levels. One is spatially, the other is in human resource terms. I think before dealing with the spatial problem in India, I think one has to deal with the human resource aspect of it. And what I mean by this is government departments, not just in India, but in many countries, are actually simply not equipped to deal with this challenge. And I think governments have to invest in training their personnel to deal with this. So I think I agree that dealing with the rural digital divide is important, and this is something that can only be done through investments through the state. In countries like Canada and Australia, particularly, investing in digital infrastructure is a very important government policy, because you have communities that live in very inaccessible parts of the country, for whom it's very, very expensive to deal. But I think in countries like India and many other developing countries, in the central government, you have people who work in central ministries who don't even know how to answer emails in the 21st century, let alone do other things. So I think this is not a federalism thing, but I think governments really need to prioritize this given that more and more services will be delivered in a digital fashion. So yeah, I don't have an answer for this, only a suggestion.
No, sir. I totally agree. And I guess that example that you cited was perfectly bang on target. When the people involved in the policy making themselves are not with that particular perspective, how can we expect especially the rural India where the question led on to? So with this, I move to the next question, which is that how, and this is asked by Neeti ma'am there, that how is China dealing with all this thing when every time they're hiding their figures? So I guess the perspective behind this particular question, I guess, that's one of those particular things, but also bring us to a point that, yes, is this a new way or where we can put as a case study that this is also a way, hide your own facts and then start also going with it. So Rupak, so your take on that bit.
This is a bit outside my comfort zone, but I'll try and address it. I mean, in the context of COVID figures, I think there is undercounting everywhere. And, I think the scale of undercounting varies by country. It varies by the motivations of policymakers. It varies by the weakness or robustness of your statistical system. But there is undercounting. Even in the first world, we are realizing now in Canada that we have undercounted our COVID figures simply because, given the scale of the pandemic, it's very difficult, A, to know, who has died from COVID, B, sort of where they have died and in which time period. So yeah, this is an ongoing challenge, and I think in all countries, including in India, we will actually know the real scale of casualties once the next census figures are done, and we know what how much excess deaths there have been. Now, within the context of China, of course, things are very opaque there. My own dissertation, PhD dissertation, was looking at one of the case studies was looking at the Great Leap Famine of 1959 to 1961, where anywhere between 35 million and 45 million Chinese died in the course of 3 years, and something that the Chinese kept hidden from public eye, and we still don't know, decades later. But that's a different issue outside the scope of this.
No, sir, I totally agree. And yes, this is somewhere in relation to our next question as well. So do natural and human disaster management automatically lead to a greater centralization of power and maybe even the misuse of power?
Okay. Just the way national disaster laws are written in all countries, it leads to a greater centralization of power, and not just a greater not just moving power up to the central government, but the concentration of power in the executive. This is just laws everywhere. I mean, even in countries like Switzerland, where you have, which have with its direct democracy and very autonomous subnational government, one of the things the national disaster management law does is simply gives all responsibilities up to the federal government. Now, they do have committees. They do have sort of a committee that oversees this with participation from the cantonal governments. But this is the nature. Now, in terms of misuse of power, I mean, that is a normative judgment. That's very difficult for me to rule on. It's so context specific in terms of what constitutes misuse of power. So I can't comment on that. But yes, disaster management leads to a centralization of power everywhere.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. I will now request Rajeshwari ma'am if she can take a couple of questions from the chat box.
No, I mean, we can continue this way, but yeah, Priyanka has a question here, and she wants to know about the gap that emerged in the practice of federal politics during the pandemic, as far as civil society's intervention is concerned. And she asks that those essential services which the governments were expected to provide, these were provided by the civil society organizations in many cases. So how do you see that, and the relationship between, I guess, Priyanka, the relationship between civil society and state, and what's the role of these two institutions?
I think this is a very important question. I think the two things we've seen during the pandemic is the role of civil society, but also the role of local governments in providing certain services. the role of local governments is somehow easier to square, square with the intergovernmental schemes that you see in many countries, and much easier to build in because they're part of the system. Civil society, I think, has been a very important part of intergovernmental relations as pressure groups, as advocacy, in their advocacy now for the greater part of 20 years. But I still don't think, even though governments will, governments recognize that they exist, I don't think governments know how to deal with civil society even now. It's simply not in the genetic makeup. Politicians, I think, have a better sense of how to deal with them, but administrations don't. And I think this is a question that will how should I say? This is not a question that's going to go away, and certainly this is a topic I think that needs to be explored in greater detail in the federalism literature going forward. Because civil society is, particularly in the context of not just of this pandemic, but I think in the context of emergencies, civil society plays such an important role in resilience, in building resilience. So, no, Priyanka, again, good question, no answer. I'm sorry. You're not going to get too many answers from me, just some thoughts.
I don't see any more questions in the chat box. So if anyone...
So maybe the chair could raise her questions before her comments.
Yeah, I mean, rather than offering my sort of concluding observations, let me just raise a couple of questions for our discussion maybe first, and then perhaps I can come back. But this whole idea of civil society prompts me to go back to this relationship between really how federal governments are operating at this particular juncture and the idea of democracy and especially representation, and which also brings in the issue of mobilization of people, which is really part of the entire concept, the idea of sharing of powers and the idea of both representation and welfare. So in the post-pandemic discussions of federalism, how do we see this relationship between democracy, mobilizations, and the idea of federalism, subnational governments? That is, at one level, we have the discussion about the multiple stakeholders, which are officially again part of the governance structure officially. And then you have a large sort of mass or the group of citizens who demand certain kind of services from the government on an urgent basis, both the central government and the state government. So I would like to know more from you about this relationship as a very prominent expert on issues related to federalism.
I don't know about prominent expert, but I'll give you my thoughts, Radishwari. So, I actually think in the post-pandemic world, we will probably see less engagement with civil society, or a less active role in civil society, because now with purse strings open all over the world, I see a trend where governments are likely to buy off certain segments of society by providing them preferential access to services and resources. And so I'm not optimistic that we will see this mobilization last beyond the current crisis, because I think people will go back. They will have received from government, whether it's at the national level or at the state level, whatever resources they need, and are then co-opted into the system of governance, often politically defined on one side or the other. Because, as you know, as is the case in many countries, civil society is not always autonomous. Civil society groups are aligned often politically one way or the other, and so this will have some bearing on sort of how this develops. Now, this is likely to vary again by country and context. I think in countries like Switzerland, which is a direct democracy, where politicians are actually part-time politicians, they don't receive a salary. Swiss elected representatives are, they have professions and they carry out their functions as parliamentarians, as local councillors, in addition to theirs, you're likely to have much greater interface with civil society, but also in countries where I think you have strong local governments, because from what I see, and I could be wrong in this, a lot of civil society groups are very concerned with what I would call the less or the more mundane aspects of livelihoods, homelessness, marginalization and poverty on the streets, those sorts of things. And in many countries, these are issues that are often addressed by local governments. And so you're likely to see more interface between local governments and civil society. But I think for the foreseeable future, apart from very large lobby groups, very large pressure groups, I think after the pandemic, state, governments at the state level and at the federal level will remain insulated, as they have been in the past from civil society pressures.
From the organizers, are there any questions? Further questions? The group that has been sitting in the conference since yesterday, so they must be having some kind of a discussion already around these issues.
With the permission, Rajeshwar, can I take?
Sure.
So would that be fine?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, so my question is basically in relation to, yes, the pandemic, what and how we have been hit across. So, and then India parallelly saw the education policy as well. And that, I guess, is the theme that we have taken, the sectoral policies today that we are taking ahead. So at this time, I guess there is a division where the GDP has to take an unprecedented flow, something that the budget was there for the country and other things across. But that shift and that management because that's where a concept of laissez-faire or a welfare state comes into play. So how would the government or how the governments are reacting and how those particular things? And as I was talking to you, I just got an in short note that a backlog of 1478 deaths have been communicated by the state government. So these are the backlog deaths. Now, the deaths cannot be backlog. We all know this. The government is putting those records as a backlog death on COVID itself, increasing the toll deaths of total of 10,000 for the state of Madhya Pradesh and something. So now in these particular contexts, how this, the division of the funds, the division or the management between the center and the state happens. So any insight on Rupak sir in that particular point?
In the context of education?
Education, like I'm talking about like education and other things which have already been budgeted, but then this pandemic hits across and the overall focus shifts to the health sector. So how that shift and how a concept of a welfare state is taken as a setback and how the government reacts to this particular setback.
Oh, I see. Okay. Look, I think governments everywhere have made the decision that budget numbers were merely suggestive, right? And so they have increasingly opened the purse strings for additional expenditures. I think this is an investment that governments will have to make everywhere. Otherwise, you're likely to have a contraction in economic activity. So, of course, healthcare is the most important thing at the moment because that's where the most immediate problem is. But I think there is a realization on the part of most governments that there has been disruption to there have been disruptions in spheres which contribute to economic health, and education is one of them. If you're not graduating people in the requisite numbers, this is going to have, and I think governments, I don't know enough about investments that have been made in India in this regard, but certainly in countries like Canada, where education is a provincial subject, just like it is in India, the federal government has come in and backstopped provincial government to say, we will provide additional funds to look after health because that's easier for us to do. And in its place, the provincial governments have gone out and taken on additional deficits in order to keep areas such as education, which are more within their area of control, going. I mean, just to give you an example, my children. So our academic year runs from September to June, and my children were so we had a very bad third wave starting in March. So between March and the end of the school year, my kids were home because schools were closed and they couldn't. So the assumption was that most people would have, in a country like Canada, have the digital infrastructure to do classes from school. But what the provincial government did was to make available resources so that kids who didn't have access to computers could come to school and borrow computers. And I think this is where this goes back to a question that was raised about digital infrastructure. And I think I think it's important for governments to invest more in digital infrastructure, even in the third world, because this will help them leapfrog some of the constraints that they've otherwise had in the delivery of services, whether it is through absentee teachers, poor, ill-maintained schools, those sorts of things. A bit like, how in India, the advent of mobile phones helped us to sort of leapfrog the constraints of landlines. I mean, many of us remember the days when you were lucky if your second or third neighbor had a phone and used that. But again, digitization and mobile phones helped us do that. And perhaps this is something that a far-seeing government could invest in to leapfrog the constraints of in-class education, particularly at the primary level.
Yeah.
Rupak, can I raise a question? Rajeshwari, do I have your permission for that?
Sure, absolutely.
I have 2 points. One, I was privileged to read this latest book, which Rupak has edited and is due to be out soon. Would you like to reflect on what succeeded in federal systems to handle COVID effectively? What were the strategies which successful countries adopted in being able to handle COVID? That's my first point. The second, I go back to a question which came earlier, which is this. Has COVID and handling COVID put such a pressure on the state in terms of resources? You are required to spend much more on welfare, but you are getting much less in terms of revenue. And is this over time going to lead to huge deficits in budgets of countries? So these would be my 2 questions.
Yeah. So I think the most successful countries have been, or the countries that have handled in the federal context. So okay, let me reformulate my ideas. I think from a non-federal perspective, the most important thing in managing COVID has been leadership. This is true in federations and non-federations. Okay? But within the context of federations, I think countries that have managed COVID better are countries where there has been greater interaction between the federal government and state governments, where the federal governments have provided the necessary resource backstop, resource not just in financial terms, but in policy terms, human terms, human resource terms, and allowed state governments or provincial governments to customize their response according to the needs of their local geographic jurisdiction. I think that, to me, that has been the most important lesson here, and we see this. I think this is particularly stark in the context of, say, how the presidential federations have handled COVID versus the parliamentary ones have handled, because it just so happens, for historic reasons, the presidential federations, the United States, Mexico's, and Argentina's of the world have virtually no interaction mechanisms for intergovernmental relations, just don't exist. So that in my view has been the most important thing, is this collaboration and consultation, if not always agreement, between the various orders of government. Now, in terms of deficits, this is a very interesting question. I think the only way these governments will avoid tying themselves down in debt and stagflation is to boost the economies towards high growth, so that the stock of debt over time becomes a very, very small liability. And I think this is, I think I it's hard to know. It's really hard to know how much the debt will drag, but provide a drag on the economy and on public finances. But it's equally true that without governments taking on debt, there is no hope in reviving many of these economies, because as we know, in the case of India, certainly people who were in the lower middle classes until recently have expended their life savings on COVID. And so without boosting the support system for them and marginalized communities more widely, there will be no consumption, and the economy will falter. So it really is devils. But I'm optimistic, and I believe that in most countries, governments are undertaking the right kinds of investments that will pay off in the long term with greater economic growth, that will make the debt not so significant. And certainly in the short term, debt servicing is not significant given how low interest rates are globally. I don't know, Sandeep, if that answers your question.
I think you have addressed the issues quite squarely.
Yeah. There is just one question that Ritika has, and I think we'll just take it up for discussion. Although we had some discussion on civil society, she wants to go back to the reduced role of civil society, and she asks whether do you think that also in the knowledge provision and providing intellectual inputs in the policy process, in terms of those areas, whether it would see a reduced role of civil society, the post-pandemic world.
Knowledge provision. No, I think when I talk of reduced role of civil society, all I'm saying is the kind of mobilization that you see in the context of the pandemic is likely to abate once the pandemic is over. And I mean, this is what we know from social mobilization literature anyway, that you have social mobilization around a particular issue. When that issue is past, people go back with their lives. I'm not suggesting that civil society will go away, or the role that they play in normal times will abate. No. I'm just talking about the level of engagement that you see around the pandemic. That is all I'm talking about. I mean, in terms of input to government agencies in policy making, again, very difficult to know how this will play out, because it really varies by country. Without naming countries, in some countries, governments tend to bring experts into the policy making role, either as consultants or as employees. And in other parts of the world, you have government servants who know everything, so they don't need expert advice because they know it all. So it really depends on the country and the context.
With this, Rajeshwari ma'am, if I can just request you, seeing the paucity of the time, that if you can just deliver your 10 minutes of concluding remarks.
Yeah, okay. Thanks everyone. Thanks Sandeep bhai and everyone in Bhopal for inviting me to this conversation. Very important conversation in the current moment. And I'm grateful to Rupak after listening to him. As I said, it was truly a quick recap of the moment we are all living in, and in which we are facing multiple challenges, especially the government agencies at various levels are facing multiple challenges, and that would provide us with a lot of potential possibilities of research, investigation, and also critical thinking. So thank you everyone for organizing this conference and making me a part of it. I won't take long, and I would be as brief as possible. I just thought that since we have begun this conversation and there are going to be some interesting papers presented during the day later on, I thought that this conversation prompts us to ask certain questions, not only regarding the role of the federal government and the state governments, but also in the context, the larger context, both in the immediate context of pandemic, but also the long-term context in which the future of welfare state will now be discussed and will be shaped in the new world. So I thought that as a student basically of Indian democracy, and who would like to read more and learn more about the comparative experiments of democracy across the world, which we learned in his very important presentation today, Rupak's very important presentation. So I thought that as a student of democracy, I would like to raise certain questions in this conversation for your consideration, which you may discuss later during the day. I would like to begin with this important concept that Dr. Chattopadhyay used in his initial remarks in the presentation, that federalism, his opposition to binaries in understanding federalism, and that federalism essentially becomes a more fluid concept. And as I was listening to him, I thought that the journey of federalism, the idea of federalism, begins with somewhere with the establishment of these welfare states during the post-Second World War period, and it develops through certain phases. And if I go back to India for a moment, then there we can discern three distinctive phases in the journey of federalism, and I thought that we can draw parallels at the global level as well. And as he was referring to states like Germany, he was referring to states like Australia, diverse states with diverse histories of formation of federalism, but also formation of development of democracies as well. And I thought that with the development of capitalism and with the development of welfare state, a certain kind of capitalism and a certain kind of notion of welfare state, federalism also as a concept became a more robust concept in the discussions of democracy, the idea of democracy and the way in which governments delivered. And so in India, we see that in the 1950s and 1960s, as Dr. Chattopadhyay also mentioned in the global context for now, there was a kind of consensus, a political and social consensus regarding service delivery and state capacities, a performance of the state, and the way in which people responded or operated within the state as citizens. And that operated in a way, that consensus operated at the global level also. And once the glory of the Second World War, post-Second World War, democracy and capitalism slowly wanes during the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, federalism becomes more about mobilization of people and people demanding certain things with the subnational governments or also with the central governments. So there emerges all over the world probably a phase of mobilization of certain groups, which also were a part of the federal movements or federal demands for federalism, strong federal governments, or more decentralization, more power sharing. And that happens along with capitalism, development of capitalism of a certain kind. I see the current moment of post-pandemic world, and I hope you would agree with that. But in the more immediate context, of course, it is about pandemic, but the long-term context at which this moment comes to us, a very challenging moment, is also about the crisis of capitalism, not just in the democracies of the South and in the democracies of the developing world, but also for the what we earlier used to call the developed world since 2007, 2008. And it is also, unfortunately, a crisis of democracy. So it would be really interesting and very sort of crucial question for us as students of federalism and as students of welfare state who are interested in looking at the future of social policy programs for various governments, to see this connection between democracy on the one hand, capitalism on the other hand, and the resulting effects on state capacities, both at the subnational level as well as at the national level. So I thought that this connection we need to sort of keep in mind constantly while discussing the issues of federalism. The reason I'm saying this is that often in the discussions of the policy discourse and the way in which social policies are implemented, we often see a kind of disjunction between the idea of democratic politics, so to say, the way in which democratic politics functions and takes shape, and sometimes we look at it, we look down upon it many a time, those scholars who are interested in the discussions of policy. So there is often a disjunction between what we understand by politics and the hardcore political process, and this idea of efficient governance which comes from the government or the policymakers and the stakeholders. They also include sometimes the civil society, what we call as the civil society. And I think that relationship or that disjunction in the academic discussions between the policy and politics was completely sort of, it was never present as far as the actual experiences and actual experiments of federal governments and welfare states were concerned. So particularly in India, the making of policies and implementation of especially social policies is always sort of rooted in, it is nested in the discussions of politics, democratic politics. So at the moment when we are experiencing a crisis of state capacities on the one hand, and when we are experiencing also a crisis for the operations of democracy, that is mobilization on the other hand, I think issues related to federalism and the discussion of power sharing and representation through federalism really pose a very serious challenge for all of us as students of democracy and as federalism. And I thank Rupak for drawing our attention to various dimensions of these challenges, the contemporary challenges that we are facing as students of federalism. And I would stop here. I once again thank Sandeep Bhai and everyone for inviting me and for your patient listening to my interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajeshwari ma'am, for that concluding remarks. And I guess after listening to Rupak sir and then the concluding remarks, they were just just like a cherry that has completed that particular cake in front of us. Many points which not only me as the person who was listening to this, but the participants and the people who all were witnessing us from the YouTube live session as well as them would have definitely taken some very great insights. That was the basic purpose. And as I've always been saying that the motto or the logo of my university, igniting mind, changing lives. Indeed, your deliberations today, both by Rupak sir and Rajeshwari ma'am, have definitely ignited our minds. And I will use the word igniting because yes, that Kindle has already been raised and would surely bring across many more research on these particular topics. On that note, thank you so much, Rupak sir. And a special thanks for making it in the morning itself. I know it's a very early morning and there across. At no point it felt that it's a 6:30 there. So that liveliness and other things have always been maintained as if it's for an afternoon or an evening time there. So thank you so much, Rupak sir, for taking out time and addressing this gathering and the topic in such a wonderful manner. Moving to Dr. Rajeshwari ma'am, superbly conducted, and that particular concluding remarks have definitely added to something that yes, especially the COVID times that have been taught. So looking from that particular angle, thank you so much, ma'am, for being here. And I would also urge that, yes, we all agree that the COVID hit us with this particular thing and we are virtually there. It would have been our super privilege to have you physical on our campus, this lush green campus, and so it would have been a great insight where we can also, like, I can see sir having a sip of tea. So that cup of tea would have been shared with all of us. I guess that over the table talk can also bring across. So on that note, thank you so much. I would also thank my fellow members from the Konrad who joined us for this deliberation. Pankaj sir, thank you so much. And all the fellow members we can see out there. And I would fail if I'll not thank my moderator for today, a role which I know sir very passionately took it for today. Thank you so much, Sandeep sir, for such a wonderful moderation. It's always been a learning thing to see you moderating these sessions. Coming to my participants and the paper presenters, we'll just quickly start with our sessions. We have 10 minutes time. The links for each session has already been emailed to you. A gentle reminder once again that we are not having this session 1. We have merged it in with session 5. So we have concurrent sessions 2, concurrent session 3, 4, and 5 running parallelly. Those who are not presenting their papers, kindly join these sessions, and through your valuable questions and insight would also add to that. And those who are presenting the papers, kindly join the links which is already mentioned. On this note, I wish each one of you a very healthy life. Please do take care of yourself in whichever part of the world you are. And if you're not taking your vaccines, please take it. That is the only outcome wherever we are. So for now, if you have taken it, that's a wonderful thing. And if you're not, please do not miss it out with that particular thing. On that note, I bid a good farewell to each one of you. A very good morning to Rupak sir, and a good evening to all others here. So thank you so much, everybody.
Devanshu, thank you very much for conducting this so nicely. And again, as I said, when Sandeep asked, if it had been 3 in the morning, I would have done it at 3 in the morning. So it's not an issue at all. Thank you, Rajeshwari, for your summing up. And I agree, the issue of democracy is very important and something that we will revisit again and again. And Pankaj, great to see you. Priyanka, Shailaja, Sandeep, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rupak. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
We'll be in touch. All the best.
Okay.
Thanks and bye-bye. It was
With
good.
With this, I'm ending the meeting, and I'll see you all on another side of the Zoom. Thank you.